Hey guys, welcome back. It's Baby Oak with another read along with me. So we're reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We're on chapter 24 called Rita Skeeter's Scoop. So here we go. Everybody got up late on Boxing Day. The Gryffindor common room was much quieter than it had been lately, many yawns punctuating the lazy conversations. Hermione's hair was bushy again. She confessed to Harry that she had used liberal amounts of Sleek Easy's hair potion on it for the ball, but it's way too much bother to do every day, she said matter-of-factly, scratching up her in Crookshanks behind the ears. Ron and Hermione seemed to have reached an unspoken agreement not to discuss their argument. They were being quite friendly to each other, though oddly formal. Ron and Harry wasted no time in telling Hermione about the conversation they had overheard between Madame Maxim and Hagrid, but Hermione didn't seem to find the news that Hagrid was a half-giant nearly as shocking as Ron did. Well, I thought he must be, she said, shrugging. I knew he couldn't be pure giant because they're about 20 feet tall. But honestly, all this hysteria about giants, they can't all be horrible. It's the same sort of prejudice that people have toward werewolves. It's just bigotry, isn't it? Ron looked as though he would have liked to reply scathingly, but perhaps he didn't want another row, because he contented himself with shaking his head disbelievingly while Hermione wasn't looking. It was time now to think of the homework they had neglected during the first week of the holidays. Everybody seemed to be feeling rather flat now that Christmas was over. Everybody except Harry, that is, who was starting, once again, to feel slightly nervous. The trouble was that February the 24th looked a lot closer from this side of Christmas, and he still hadn't done anything about working out the clue inside the golden egg. He therefore started taking the egg out of his trunk every time he went up to the dormitory, opening it and listening intently, hoping that this time it would make some sense. He strained to think what the sound reminded him of, apart from 30 musical saws, but he had never heard anything else like it. He closed the egg, shook it vigorously, and opened it again to see if the sound had changed, but it hadn't. He tried asking the egg questions, shouting over all the wailing, but nothing happened. He even threw the egg across the room, though he hadn't really expected that to help. Harry had not forgotten the hint that Cedric had given him, but his less than friendly feelings toward Cedric just now meant that he was keen not to take his help if he could avoid it. In any case, it seemed to him that if Cedric hadn't really wanted to give Harry a hand, he would have been a lot more explicit. He, Harry, had told Cedric exactly what was coming in the first task, and Cedric's idea of a fair exchange had been to tell Harry to take a bath. Well, he didn't need that sort of rubbishy help, not from someone who kept walking down the corridors hand in hand with Cho anyway. And so the first day of the new term arrived, and Harry set off to lessons, weighed down with books, parchment, and quills, as usual, but also with the lurking worry of the egg heavy in his stomach, as though he were carrying that around with him too. Snow was still thick upon the grounds, and the greenhouse windows were covered in condensation so thick that they couldn't see out of them in herbology. Nobody else looking forward to care of magical creatures much in this weather, though as Ron said, the Scroots would probably warm them up nicely, either by chasing them or blasting off so forcefully that Hagrid's cabin would catch fire. When they arrived at Hagrid's cabin, however, they found an elderly witch with closely cropped gray hair and a very prominent chin standing before his front door. Hurry up now, the bell rang 5 minutes ago, she barked at them as they struggled toward her through the snow. Who are you? Said Ron, staring at her. Where's Hagrid? My name is Professor Grubbly-Plank, she said briskly. I am your temporary care of magical creatures teacher. Where's Hagrid? Harry repeated loudly. He is indisposed, said Professor Grubbly-Plank shortly. Soft and unpleasant laughter reached Harry's ears. He turned. Draco Malfoy and the rest of the Slytherins were joining the class. All of them looked gleeful, and none of them looked surprised to see Professor Grubbly-Plank. This way, please, said Professor Grubbly-Plank, and she strode off around the paddock where the Beauxbatons horses were shivering. Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed her, looking back over their shoulders at Hagrid's cabin. All the curtains were closed. Was Hagrid in there, alone and ill? What's wrong with Hagrid? Harry said, hurrying to catch up with Professor Grubbly-Plank. Never you mind, she said as though she thought he was being nosy. I do mind, though, said Harry hotly. What's up with him? Professor Grubbly-Plank acted as though she couldn't hear him. She led them past the paddock where the huge Beauxbaton horses were standing, huddled against the cold, and toward a tree on the edge of the forest, where a large and beautiful unicorn was tethered. Many of the girls oohed at the sight of the unicorn. Oh, it's so beautiful, whispered Lavender Brown. How did she get it? They're supposed to be really hard to catch. The unicorn was so brightly white it made the snow all around look gray. It was pawing the ground nervously with its golden hooves and throwing back its horned head. Boys, keep up. Boys, keep back. barked Professor Grubbly Plank, throwing out an arm and catching Harry hard in the chest. They prefer the women's touch, unicorns. Girls to the front and approach with care. Come on, easy does it. She and the girls walked slowly forward toward the unicorn, leaving the boys standing near the paddock fence watching. The moment Professor Grubbly Plank was out of earshot, Harry turned to Ron. What do you reckon's wrong with him? You don't think a screw. Oh, he hasn't been attacked, Potter, if that's what you're thinking, said Malfoy softly. No, he's just too ashamed to show his big ugly face. What do you mean? Said Harry sharply. Malfoy put his hand inside the pocket of his robes and pulled out a folded page of newsprint. There you go, he said. Hate to break it to you, Potter. He smirked as Harry snatched the page, unfolded it, and read it, with Ron, Seamus Dean, and Neville looking over his shoulder. It was an article topped with a picture of Hagrid looking extremely shifty. Dumbledore's giant mistake. Albus Dumbledore, eccentric headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, has never been afraid to make controversial staff appointments, writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. In September of this year, he hired Alistair Mad-Eye Moody, the notoriously jinx-happy ex-Auror, to teach Defense Against the Dark Arts, a decision that caused many raised eyebrows at the Ministry of Magic, given Moody's well-known habit of attacking anybody who makes a sudden movement in his presence. Mad-Eye Moody, however, looks responsible and kindly when set beside the part-human Dumbledore employs to teach care of magical creatures. Rubeus Hagrid, who admits to being expelled from Hogwarts in his third year, has enjoyed the position of gamekeeper at the school ever since, a job secured for him by Dumbledore. Last year, however, Hagrid used his mysterious influence over the headmasters to secure the additional post of care of magical creatures teacher over the heads of many better qualified candidates. An alarmingly large and ferocious-looking man, Hagrid has been using his newfound authority to terrify the students in his care with a succession of horrific creatures. While Dumbledore turns a blind eye, Hagrid has maimed several pupils during a series of lessons that many admit to being very frightening. I was attacked by a hippogriff, and my friend Vincent Crabbe got a bad bite off of a flobberworm, says Draco Malfoy, a fourth-year student. We all hate Hagrid, but we're just too scared to say anything. Hagrid has no intention of ceasing his campaign of intimidation, however. In conversation with the Daily Prophet reporter last month, he admitted breeding creatures he has dubbed blast-ended scroots, highly dangerous crosses between manticores and fire crabs. The creation of new breeds of magical creature is, of course, an activity usually closely observed by the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Hagrid, however, considers himself to be above such petty restrictions. I was just having some fun, he says, before hastily changing the subject. As if this were not enough, the Daily Prophet has now unearthed evidence that Hagrid is not, as he has always pretended, a pure-blood wizard. He is not, in fact, even pure human. His mother, we can exclusively reveal, is none other than the giantess Fridwulfa, whose whereabouts are currently unknown. Bloodthirsty and brutal, the giants brought themselves to the point of extinction by wearing against themselves during the last century. The handful that remained joined the ranks of He Who Must Not Be Named, and were responsible for some of the worst mass muggle killings of his reign of terror. While many of the giants who served He Who Must Not Be Named were killed by Aurors working against the dark side, Fridwulfa was not among them. It is possible she escaped to one of the giant communities still existing in foreign mountain ranges. If his antics during care of magical creatures lessons are any guide, however, Fridwulfa's son appears to have inherited her brutal nature. In a bizarre twist, Hagrid is reputed to have developed a close friendship with the boy who brought around you-know-who's fall from power, thereby driving Hagrid's own mother, like the rest of you-know-who's supporters, into hiding. Perhaps Harry Potter is unaware of the unpleasant truth about his large friend, but Albus Dumbledore surely has a duty to ensure that Harry Potter, along with his fellow students, is warned about the dangers of associating with part giants. Harry finished reading and looked up at Ron, whose mouth was hanging open. How did she find out? He whispered. But that wasn't what was bothering Harry. What do you mean we all hate Hagrid? Harry spat at Malfoy. What's this rubbish about him? He pointed at Crabbe, getting a bad bite off of a flobberworm. They haven't even got teeth. Crabbe was snickering, apparently very pleased with himself. Well, I think this should put an end to the oaf's teaching career, said Malfoy, his eyes glinting. Half giant, and there was me thinking he just swallowed a bottle of Skelligrill when he was young. None of the mummies and daddies are going to like this at all. They'll be worried he'll eat their kids. Ha ha. Are you paying attention over there? Professor Grubbly Plank's voice carried over to the boys. The girls were all clustered around the unicorn now, stroking it. Harry was so angry that the Daily Prophet article shook in his hands as he turned to stare unseeingly at the unicorn, whose many magical properties Professor Grubbly Plank was now enumerating in a loud voice so that the boys could hear too. I hope she stays, that woman, said Pavarti Patel when the lesson had ended. They were all heading back to the castle for lunch. That's more what I thought care of magical creatures would be like. Proper creatures like unicorns, not monsters. What about Hagrid? Harry said angrily as they went up the steps. What about him? Said Pavarti in a hard voice. He can still be gamekeeper, can't he? Pavarti had been very cool toward Harry since the ball. He supposed that he ought to have paid her a bit more attention, but she seemed to have a good time all the same. She was certainly telling anybody who would listen that she had made arrangements to meet the boy from Beauxbatons and Hogsmeade on the next weekend trip. That was a really good lesson, said Hermione as they entered the Great Hall. I didn't know half the things Professor Grubbly Plank told us about you. Look at this, Harry snarled, and he shoved the Daily Prophet article under Hermione's nose. Hermione's mouth fell open as she read. Her reaction was exactly the same as Ron's. How did that horrible Skeeter woman find out? You don't think Hagrid told her? No, said Harry, leading the way over to the Gryffindor table and throwing himself into a chair, furious. He never even told us, did he? I reckon she was so mad he wouldn't give her loads of horrible stuff about me if she went ferreting around to get him back. Maybe she heard him telling Madame Maxim at the ball, said Hermione quietly. We'd have seen her in the garden, said Ron. Anyway, she's not supposed to come into school anymore. Hagrid said Dumbledore banned her. Maybe she's got an invisibility cloak, said Harry, ladling chicken casserole onto his plate and splashing it everywhere in his anger. Sort of thing she'd do, isn't it? Hide in bushes listening to people. Like you and Ron did, you mean, said Hermione. We weren't trying to hear him, said Ron indignantly. We didn't have any choice. The stupid prat talked about his giantess mother where anyone could have heard him. We've got to go and see him, said Harry, this evening after divination. Tell him we want him back. You do want him back, he shot at Hermione. I'm not going to pretend it didn't make a nice change, having a proper care of magical creatures lesson for once, but I do want Hagrid back. Of course I do. Hermione added hastily, quailing under Harry's furious stare. So that evening after dinner, the three of them left the castle once more and went down through the frozen grounds to Hagrid's cabin. They knocked, and Fang's booming barks answered. Hagrid, it's us, Harry shouted, pounding on the door. Open up. Hagrid didn't answer. They could hear Fang scratching at the door, whining, but it didn't open. They hammered on it for 10 more minutes. Ron even went and banged on one of the windows, but there was no response. What's he avoiding us for? Hermione said when they had finally given up and were walking back to the school. He surely doesn't think we'd care about him being half giant. But it seemed that Hagrid did care. They didn't see a sign of him all week. He didn't appear at the staff table at mealtimes. They didn't see him going about his gamekeeper duties on the grounds. And Professor Grubbly Plank continued to take the care of magical creatures classes. Malfoy was gloating at every possible opportunity. Missing your half-breed pal, he kept whispering to Harry whenever there was a teacher around, so that he was safe from Harry's retaliation. Missing the Elephant Man. There was a Hogsmeade visit halfway through January. Hermione was very surprised that Harry was going to go. I just thought you'd want to take advantage of the common room being quiet, she said. Really get to work on that egg. Oh, I reckon I've got a pretty good idea what it's about now, Harry lied. Have you really? Said Hermione, looking impressed. Well done. Harry's insides gave a guilty squirm, but he ignored them. He still had 5 weeks to work out that egg clue, after all, and that was ages, whereas if he went into Hogsmeade, he might run into Hagrid and get a chance to persuade him to come back. He, Ron, and Hermione left the castle together on Saturday and set off through the cold, wet grounds toward the gates. As they passed the Durmstrang ship moored in the lake, they saw Victor Crumb emerge onto the deck dressed in nothing but swimming trunks. He was very skinny indeed, but apparently a lot tougher than he looked, because he climbed up onto the side of the ship, stretched out his arms, and dived right into the lake. He's mad, said Harry, staring at Crumb's dark head as it bobbed out into the middle of the lake. It must be freezing. It's January. It's a lot colder where he comes from, said Hermione. I suppose it feels quite warm to him. Yeah, but there's still the giant squid, said Ron. He didn't sound anxious, if anything. He sounded hopeful. Hermione noticed his tone of voice and frowned. He's really nice, you know, she said. He's not at all like you'd think coming from Durmstrang. He likes it much better here, he told me. Ron said nothing. He hadn't mentioned Victor Crumb since the ball, but Harry had found a miniature arm under his bed on Boxing Day, which he had looked very much as though it had been snapped off a small model figure wearing Bulgarian Quidditch robes. Harry kept his eyes skinned for a sign of Hagrid all the way down the slushy high street, and suggested a visit to the Three Broomsticks once he had ascertained that Hagrid was not in any of the shops. The pub was as crowded as ever, but one quick look around at all the tables told Harry that Hagrid wasn't there. Heart sinking, he went up to the bar with Ron and Hermione, ordered 3 butterbeers from Madame Rosmerta, and thought gloomily that he might just as well have stayed behind and listened to the egg wailing after all. Doesn't he ever go into the office? Hermione whispered suddenly. Look. She pointed into the mirror behind the bar, and Harry saw Lodo Bagman reflected there, sitting in a shadowy corner with a bunch of goblins. Bagman was talking very fast in a low voice to the goblins, all of whom had their arms crossed and were looking rather menacing. It was indeed odd, Harry thought, that Bagman was here at the Three Broomsticks on a weekend when there was no Triwizard event, and therefore no judging to be done. He watched Bagman in the mirror. He was looking strained again, quite as strained as he had that night in the forest before the dark mark had appeared. But just then Bagman glanced over at the bar, saw Harry, and stood up. In a moment, Harry heard him say brusquely to the goblins, and Bagman hurried through the pub toward Harry, his boyish grin back in place. "Harry," he said, "how are you? Been hoping to run into you. Everything going all right?" "Fine, thanks," said Harry. "Wonder if I could have a quick private word, Harry," said Bagman eagerly. "You couldn't give us a moment, you two, could you?" Okay," said Ron, and he and Hermione went off to find a table. Bagman led Harry along the bar to the end furthest from Madame Rosmerta. "Well, I just thought I'd congratulate you again on your splendid performance against that horntail, Harry," said Bagman. "Really superb." "Thanks," said Harry, but he knew this couldn't be all that Bagman wanted to say, because he could have congratulated Harry in front of Ron and Hermione. Bagman didn't seem in any particular rush to spill the beans, though. Harry saw him glance into the mirror over the bar at the goblins, who were all watching him, and Harry in silence through their dark, slanting eyes. "Absolute nightmare," said Bagman to Harry in an undertone, noticing Harry watching the goblins too. "Their English isn't too good. It's like being back with all the Bulgarians at the Quidditch World Cup, but at least they used sign language another human could recognize. This lot keep gabbling in gobbledygook, and I only know one word of gobbledygook. Blodvok. It means pickaxe. I don't like to use it in any case. They think I'm threatening them." He gave a short, booming laugh. "What do they want?" Harry said, noticing how the goblins were still watching Bagman very closely. Well," said Bagman, looking suddenly nervous, they're looking for Barty Crouch." "Why are they looking for him here?" said Harry. "He's at the Ministry in London, isn't he?" As a matter of fact, I've no idea where he is," said Bagman. "He sort of stopped coming to work. Been absent for a couple of weeks now. Young Percy, his assistant, says he's ill. Apparently he's just been sending instructions in by owl. But would you mind not mentioning that to anyone, Harry? Because Rita Skeeter's still poking around everywhere she can, and I'm willing to bet she'd work up Barty's illness into something sinister. Probably say he's gone missing like Bertha Jorkins." "Have you heard anything about Bertha Jorkins?" Harry asked. "No," said Bagman, looking strained again. "I've got people looking, of course. About time," thought Harry. "And it's all very strange. She definitely arrived in Albania because she met her second cousin there, and then she left the cousin's house to go south and see an aunt, and she seems to have vanished without trace en route. Blowed if I can see where she's got to. She doesn't seem the type to elope, for instance, but still, what are we doing, talking about goblins and Bertha Jorkins? I really wanted to ask you," he lowered his voice, "how are you getting on with your golden egg?" Not bad," said Harry untruthfully. Bagman seemed to know he wasn't being honest. "Listen, Harry," he said, still in a very low voice, "I feel very bad about all this. You were thrown into this tournament, you didn't volunteer for it, and if—" His voice was so quiet now, Harry had to lean closer to listen. "If I can help at all, a prod in the right direction, I've taken a liking to you, the way you got past that dragon. Well, just say the word." Harry stared up into Bagman's round, rosy face and his wide, baby blue eyes. "We're supposed to work out the clues alone, aren't we?" he said, careful to keep his voice casual and not sound as though he was accusing the head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports of breaking the rules. Well, yes," said Bagman impatiently, "but, come on, Harry, we all want a Hogwarts victory, don't we?" "Have you offered Cedric help?" Harry said. The smallest of frowns creased Bagman's smooth face. "No, I haven't," he said. Like I say, I've taken a liking to you. Just thought I'd offer." "Well, thanks," said Harry, "but I think I'm nearly there with the egg. Couple more days should crack it." He wasn't entirely sure why he was refusing Bagman's help, except that Bagman was almost a stranger to him, and accepting his assistance would feel somehow much more like cheating than asking advice from Ron, Hermione, or Sirius. Bagman looked almost affronted, but couldn't say much more as Fred and George turned up at that point. "Hello, Mr. Bagman," said Fred brightly. "Can we buy you a drink?" No," said Bagman, with a last disappointed glance to Harry. "No, thank you, boys." Fred and George looked quite as disappointed as Bagman, who was surveying Harry as though he had let him down badly. "Well, I must dash," he said. "Nice seeing you all. Good luck, Harry." He hurried out of the pub. The goblins all slid off their chairs and exited after him. Harry went to rejoin Ron and Hermione. "What did he want?" Ron said, the moment Harry had sat down. "He offered to help me with the golden egg," said Harry. "He shouldn't be doing that," said Hermione, looking very shocked. "He's one of the judges. And anyway, you've already Probably worked it out, haven't you? Nearly, said Harry. Well, I don't think Dumbledore would like it if he knew Bagman was trying to persuade you to cheat, said Hermione, still looking deeply disapproving. I hope he's trying to help Cedric as much. He's not. I asked, said Harry. Who cares if Diggory's getting help, said Ron. Harry privately agreed. Those goblins didn't look very friendly, said Hermione, sipping her butterbeer. What were they doing here? Looking for Crouch, according to Bagman, said Harry. He's still ill. Hasn't been into work. Maybe Percy's poisoning him, said Ron. Probably thinks if Crouch snuffs it, he'll be made head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Hermione gave Ron a don't joke about things like that look and said, funny goblins looking for Mr. Crouch. They'd normally deal with the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Crouch can speak loads of different languages, though, said Harry. Maybe they need an interpreter. Worrying about poor ickle goblins now, are you? Ron asked Hermione, thinking of starting up SPUG or something. Society for the Protection of Ugly Goblins. Ha ha ha, said Hermione sarcastically. Goblins don't need protection. Haven't you been listening to what Professor Binns has been telling us about goblin rebellions? No, said Harry and Ron together. Well, they're quite capable of dealing with wizards, said Hermione, taking another sip of butterbeer. They're very clever. They're not like house elves, who never stick up for themselves. Uh-oh, said Ron, staring at the door. Rita Skeeter had just entered. She was wearing banana yellow robes today. Her long nails were painted shocking pink, and she was accompanied by her paunchy photographer. She bought drinks, and she and the photographer made their way through the crowds to a table nearby. Harry, Ron, and Hermione glaring at her as she approached. She was talking fast and looking very satisfied about something. Didn't seem very keen to talk to us, did he, bozo? Now, why would that be, do you think? And what's he doing with a pack of goblins in tow anyway? Showing them the sights? What nonsense. He was always a bad liar. Reckon something's up. Think we should do a bit of digging. Disgraced ex-head of magical games and sports, little Bagman. Snappy start to a sentence. Bozo, we just need to find a story to fit it. Trying to ruin someone else's life, said Harry loudly. A few people looked around. Rita Skeeter's eyes widened behind her jeweled spectacles as she saw who had spoken. Harry, she said, beaming. How lovely. Why don't you come and join? I wouldn't come near you with a 10-foot broomstick, said Harry furiously. What did you do that to Hagrid for, eh? Rita Skeeter raised her heavily penciled eyebrows. Our readers have a right to the truth, Harry. I am merely doing my... Who cares if he's half giant? Harry shouted. There's nothing wrong with him. The whole pub had gone very quiet. Madame Rosmerta was staring over from behind the bar, apparently oblivious to the fact that the flagon she was filling with mead was overflowing. Rita Skeeter's smile flickered very slightly, but she hitched it back almost at once. She snapped open her crocodile skin handbag, pulled out her quick quotes quill, and said, How about giving me an interview about the Hagrid you know, Harry, the man behind the muscles? Your unlikely friendship and the reasons behind it. Would you call him a father substitute? Hermione stood up very abruptly, her butterbeer clutched in her hand as though it were a grenade. You horrible woman, she said through gritted teeth. You don't care, do you? Anything for a story, and anyone will do, won't they? Even little Bagman. Sit down, you silly little girl, and don't talk about things you don't understand, said Rita Skeeter coldly, her eyes hardening as they fell on Hermione. I know things about little Bagman that would make your hair curl. Not that it needs it, she added, eyeing Hermione's bushy hair. Let's go, said Hermione. Come on, Harry, Ron. They left. Many people were staring at them as they went. Harry glanced back as they reached the door. Rita Skeeter's quick quotes quill was out. It was zooming backward and forward over a piece of parchment on the table. She'll be after you next, Hermione, said Ron in a low, worried voice as they walked quickly back up the street. Let her try, said Hermione defiantly. She was shaking with rage. I'll show her. Silly little girl, am I? Oh, I'll get her back for this. First Harry, then Hagrid. You don't want to go upsetting Rita Skeeter, said Ron nervously. I'm serious, Hermione. She'll dig up something on you. My parents don't read the Daily Prophet. She can't scare me into hiding, said Hermione, now striding along it so fast that it was all Harry and Ron could do to keep up with her. The last time Harry had seen Hermione in a rage like this, she had hit Draco Malfoy around the face, and Hagrid isn't hiding anymore. He should never have let that excuse of a human being upset him. Come on. Breaking into a run, she led them all the way back up the road, through the gates flanked by winged boars, and up through the grounds to Hagrid's cabin. The curtains were still drawn, and they could hear Fang barking as they approached. Hagrid, Hermione shouted, pounding on his front door. Hagrid, that's enough. We know you're in there. Nobody cares if your mum was a giantess, Hagrid. You can't let that foul Skeeter woman do this to you. Hagrid, get out here. You're just being... The door opened. Hermione said, about... and then stopped very suddenly, because she had found herself face to face not with Hagrid, but with Albus Dumbledore. Good afternoon, he said pleasantly, smiling down at them. We wanted to see Hagrid, said Hermione in a rather small voice. Yes, I've surmised as much, said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. Why don't you come in? Oh, okay, said Hermione. She, Ron, and Harry went into the cabin. Fang launched himself upon Harry the moment he entered, barking madly and trying to lick his ears. Harry fended off Fang and looked around. Hagrid was sitting at his table where there were 2 large mugs of tea. He looked a real mess. His face was blotchy, his eyes swollen, and he had gone to the other extreme where his hair was concerned. Far from trying to make it behave, it now looked like a wig of tangled wire. Hi, Hagrid, said Harry. Hagrid looked up. Lo, he said in a very hoarse voice. More tea, I think, said Dumbledore, closing the door behind Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Drawing out his wand and twiddling it, a revolving tea tray appeared in midair along with a plate of cakes. Dumbledore magicked the tray onto the table, and everybody sat down. There was a slight pause, and then Dumbledore said, Did you by any chance hear what Miss Granger was shouting, Hagrid? Hermione went slightly pink, but Dumbledore smiled at her and continued, Hermione, Harry, and Ron still seemed to want to know you, judging by the way they were attempting to break down the door. Of course we still want to know you, Harry said, staring at Hagrid. You don't think anything that Skeeter cow. Sorry, Professor, he added, quickly looking at Dumbledore. I have gone temporarily deaf and haven't any idea what you said, Harry, said Dumbledore, twiddling his thumbs and staring at the ceiling. Oh, right, said Harry sheepishly. I just meant, Hagrid, how could you think we'd care what that woman wrote about you? 2 fat tears leaked out of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes and fell slowly into his tangled beard. Living proof of what I've been telling you, Hagrid, said Dumbledore, still looking carefully up at the ceiling. I have shown you the letters from the countless parents who remember you from their own days here, telling me in no uncertain terms that if I sacked you, they would have something to say about it. Not all of them, said Hagrid hoarsely. Not all of them want me to stay. Really, Hagrid, if you are holding out for universal popularity, I'm afraid you will be in this cabin for a very long time, said Dumbledore, now peering sternly over his half-moon spectacles. Not a week has passed since I became headmaster of this school when I haven't had at least one owl complaining about the way I run it. But what should I do? Barricade myself in my study and refuse to talk to anybody? Yeah, you're not half giant, said Hagrid crokily. Hagrid, look what I've done. Look what I've got for relatives, Harry said furiously. Look at the Dursleys. An excellent point, said Professor Dumbledore. My own brother, Aberforth, was prosecuted for practicing inappropriate charms on a goat. It was all over the papers. But did Aberforth hide? No, he did not. He held his head high and went about his business as usual. Of course, I'm not entirely sure he can read, so that may not have been bravery. Come back and teach, Hagrid, said Hermione quietly. Please come back. We really miss you. Hagrid gulped. More tears leaked out down his cheeks and into his tangled beard. Dumbledore stood up. I refuse to accept your resignation, Hagrid, and I expect you back at work on Monday, he said. You will join me for breakfast at 8:30 in the Great Hall. No excuses. Good afternoon to you all. Dumbledore left the cabin, pausing only to scratch Fang's ears. When the door had shut behind him, Hagrid began to sob into his dustbin lid-sized hands. Hermione kept patting his arm, and at last Hagrid looked up, his eyes very red indeed, and said, Great man, Dumbledore, great man. Yeah, he is, said Ron. Can I have one of these cakes, Hagrid? Help yourself, said Hagrid, wiping his eyes on the back of his hand. He's right, of course. You're all right. I've been stupid. Me old dad would have been ashamed of the way I've been behaving. More tears leaked out, but he wiped them away more forcefully and said, Never shown you a picture of my old dad, have I? Here. Hagrid got up, went over to his dresser, opened a drawer, and pulled out a picture of a short wizard with Hagrid's crinkled black eyes beaming as he sat on top of Hagrid's shoulder. Hagrid was a good 7 or 8 feet tall, judging by the apple tree beside him, but his face was beardless, young, round, and smooth. He looked hardly older than 11. That was taken just after I got into Hogwarts, Hagrid croaked. Dad was dead chuffed. Thought I might not be a wizard, see, 'cause me mum. Well, anyway, course I never was great shakes at magic, really, but at least he never saw me expelled. Died, see, in me second year. And Dumbledore was the only one who stuck up for me after Dad went. Got me the gamekeeper job. Trust me, he does. Gives him second chances. That's what sets him apart from other heads, see? He'll accept anyone in Hogwarts so long as they've got the talent. Knows people can turn out okay, even if their families weren't. Well, all that respectable. But some don't understand that. There's some who'd always hold it against you. There's some who'd even pretend they just had big bones rather than stand up and say, I am what I am, and I'm not ashamed. Never be ashamed, my old dad used to say. There's some who'll hold it against you, but they're not worth bothering with. And he was right. I've been an idiot. I'm not bothering with her and no more. I promise you that. Big bones. I'll give her big bones. Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked at one another nervously. Harry would rather have taken 50 blasted scroots for a walk than admit to Hagrid that he had overheard him talking to Madame Maxim, but Hagrid was still talking, apparently unaware that he had said anything odd. "You know what, Harry?" he said, looking up from the photograph of his father, his eyes very bright. "When I first met you, you reminded me a bit. Mom and Dad gone, and you was feeling like you wouldn't fit in at Hogwarts. Remember? Not sure you were really up to it. And now look at you, Harry, school champion." He looked at Harry for a moment and then said very seriously, "You know what I'd love, Harry? I'd love you to win. I really would. It'd show 'em all. You don't have to be pure blood to do it. You don't have to be ashamed of what you are. It'd show 'em Dumbledore's the one who's got it right, letting anyone in as long as they can do magic. How you doing with that egg, Harry?" "Great," said Harry. "Really great." Hagrid's miserable face broke into a wide, watery smile. "That's my boy. You show 'em. Harry, you show 'em. Beat 'em all." Lying to Hagrid wasn't quite like lying to anyone else. Harry went back to the castle later that afternoon with Ron and Hermione, unable to banish the image of the happy expression on Hagrid's whiskery face as he had imagined Harry winning the tournament. The incomprehensible egg weighed more heavily than ever on Harry's conscience that evening, and by the time he had gotten to bed, he had made up his mind. It was time to shelf his pride and see if Cedric Tint was worth anything. Alright, 1 second, guys. I need to be right back. Okay. Chapter 25, The Egg and the Eye. As Harry had no idea how long a bath he would need to work out the secret of the golden egg, he decided to do it at night when he would be able to take as much time as he wanted. Reluctant though he was to accept more favors from Cedric, he also decided to use the prefix bathroom. Far fewer people were allowed in there, so it was much less likely that he would be disturbed. Harry planned his excursion carefully because he had been caught out of bed and out of bounds by Filch, the caretaker, in the middle of the night once before, and had no desire to repeat the experience. The invisibility cloak would, of course, be essential, and as an added precaution, Harry thought he would take the Marauder's map, which, next to the cloak, was the most useful aid to rule-breaking Harry owned. The map showed the whole of Hogwarts, including its many shortcuts and secret passageways, and most important of all, it revealed the people inside the castle as minuscule labeled dots moving around the corridors so that Harry would be forewarned if somebody was approaching the bathroom. On Thursday night, Harry sneaked up to bed, put on the cloak, crept back downstairs, and just as he had done on the night when Hagrid had shown him the dragons, waited for the portrait hole to open. This time it was Ron who waited outside to give the fat lady the password. "Banana fritters." "Good luck," Ron muttered, climbing into the room as Harry crept out past him. It was awkward moving under the cloak tonight because Harry had the heavy egg under one arm and the map held in front of his nose with the other. However, the moonlit corridors were empty and silent, and by checking the map at strategic intervals, Harry was able to ensure that he wouldn't run into anyone he wanted to avoid. When he reached the statue of Boris the Bewildered, a lost-looking wizard with his gloves on the wrong hands, he located the right door, leaned close to it, and muttered the password, "Pine Fresh," just as Cedric had told him. The door creaked open. Harry slipped inside, bolted the door behind him, and pulled off the invisibility cloak, looking around. His immediate reaction was that it would be worth becoming a prefect just to be able to use this bathroom. It was softly lit by a splendid candle-filled chandelier, and everything was made of white marble, including what looked like an empty, rectangular swimming pool sunk into the middle of the floor. About 100 golden taps stood all around the pool's edges, each with a differently colored jewel set into its handle. There was also a diving board, long white linen curtains hung at the windows, a large pile of fluffy white towels sat in the corner, and there was a single golden framed painting on the wall. There's a diving board for a bathtub? That is a swimming pool. That's not a bathtub at that point. That's a swimming pool. It featured a blonde mermaid who was fast asleep on a rock, her long hair over her face. It fluttered every time she snored. Harry moved forward, looking around, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Magnificent though the bathroom was, and quite keen though he was to try out a few of those taps. Now he was here, he couldn't quite suppress the feeling that Cedric might have been having him on. How on earth was this supposed to help solve the mystery of the egg? Nevertheless, he put one of the fluffy towels, the cloak, the map, and the egg at the side of the swimming pool-sized bath, then knelt down and turned on a few of the taps. He could tell at once that they carried different sorts of bubble bath mixed with water, though it wasn't bubble bath as Harry had experienced it. One tap gushed pink and blue bubbles the size of footballs. Another poured ice-white foam so thick that Harry thought it would have supported his weight if he cared to test it. A third sent heavily perfumed purple clouds hovering over the surface of the water. Harry amused himself for a while, turning the taps on and off, particularly enjoying the effect of one whose jet bounced off the surface of the water in large arches. Then, when the deep pool was full of hot water, foam, and bubbles, each took a very short time considering its size, Harry turned off all the taps, pulled off his pajamas, slippers, and dressing gown, and slid into the water. It was so deep that his feet barely touched the bottom, and he actually did a couple of links before swimming back to the side and treading water, staring at the egg. Highly enjoyable, though it was to swim in hot and foamy water with clouds of different colored steam wafting all around him. No stroke of brilliance came to him, no sudden burst of understanding. Harry stretched out his arms, lifted the egg in his wet hands, and opened it. The wailing, screeching sound filled the bathroom, echoing and reverberating off the marble walls, but it sounded just as incomprehensible as ever, if not more so with the echoes. He snapped it shut again, worried that the sound would attract Filch, wondering whether that hadn't been Cedric's plan, and then making him jump so badly that he dropped the egg, which clattered away across the bathroom floor. Someone spoke. "I'd try putting it in the water if I were you." Harry had swallowed a considerable amount of bubbles in shock. He stood up, sputtering, and saw the ghost of a very glum-looking girl sitting cross-legged on top of one of the taps. It was Moaning Myrtle, who was usually to be heard sobbing in the S-bend of a toilet 3 floors below. "Myrtle," Harry said in outrage, I'm not wearing anything." The foam was so dense that this hardly mattered, but he had a nasty feeling that Myrtle had been spying on him from out of one of the taps ever since he had arrived. "I closed my eyes when you got in," she said, blinking at him through the thick spectacles. "You haven't been to see me for ages." "Yeah, well," said Harry, bending his knees slightly just to make absolutely sure Myrtle couldn't see anything but his head. "I'm not supposed to come into your bathroom, am I? It's a girl's one?" "You didn't used to care," said Myrtle miserably. "You used to be in there all the time." This was true, though only because Harry, Ron, and Hermione had found Myrtle's out-of-order toilets a convenient place to brew Polyjuice Potion in secret, a forbidden potion that had turned him and Ron into living replicas of Crabbe and Goyle for an hour, so that they could sneak into the Slytherin common room. I got told off for going in there," said Harry, which was half true. Percy had once caught him coming out of Myrtle's bathroom. "I thought I'd better not come back after that." "Oh, I see," said Myrtle, picking at a spot in her chin in a morose sort of way. "Well, anyway, I'd tried the egg in the water. That's what Cedric Diggory did." "Have you been spying on him, too?" said Harry indignantly. What do you do? Sneak up in here in the evenings to watch the prefects take baths?" "Sometimes," said Myrtle rather slyly. "But I've never come out to speak to anyone before." "I'm honored," said Harry darkly. "You keep your eyes shut." He made sure Myrtle had her glasses well covered before hoisting himself out of the bath, wrapping the towel firmly around his waist, and going to retrieve the egg. Once he was back in the water, Myrtle peered through her fingers and said, "Go on, then. Open it under the water." Harry lowered the egg between the foamy surface and opened it, and this time it did not wail. A gurgling sound was coming out of it, a song whose words he couldn't distinguish through the water. "You need to put your head under, too," said Myrtle, who seemed to be thoroughly enjoying bossing him around. "Go on." Harry took a great breath and slid under the surface, and now sitting on the marble bottom of the bubble-filled bath, he heard a chorus of eerie voices singing to him from the open egg in his hands. "Come seek us where our voices sound, we cannot sing above the ground. And while you're searching, ponder this, we've taken what you'll sorely miss. An hour long you'll have to look, and to recover what we took. But past an hour, the prospect's black. Too late, it's gone, it won't come back." Harry let himself float back upward and broke the bubbly surface, shaking his hair out of his eyes. "Hear it?" said Myrtle. "Yeah, come seek us where our voices sound. And if I need persuading, hang on, I need to listen again." He sank back under the water. It took 3 more underwater renditions of the egg's song before Harry had it memorized. Then he trod water for a while, thinking hard while Myrtle sat and watched him. "I've got to go and look for people who can't use their voices above the ground," he said slowly. Who could that be?" "Slow, aren't you?" He had never seen Moaning Myrtle so cheerful, apart from the day when a dose of Polyjuice Potion had given Hermione the hairy face and tail of a cat. Harry stared around the bathroom, thinking if the voices could only be heard underwater, then it made sense for them to belong to underwater creatures. He ran his theory past Myrtle, who smirked at him. Well, that's what Diggory thought, she said. He lay there talking to himself for ages about it, ages and ages. Nearly all the bubbles had gone. Underwater? Harry said slowly. Myrtle, what lives in the lake apart from the giant squid? Oh, all sorts, she said. I sometimes go down there. Sometimes don't have any choice if someone flushes my toilet when I'm not expecting it. Trying not to think about Moaning Myrtle zooming down a pipe to the lake with the contents of a toilet, Harry said, well, does anything in there have a human voice? Hang on. Harry's eyes had fallen on the picture of the snoozing mermaid on the wall. Myrtle, there aren't mer-people in there, are there? Oh, very good, she said, her thick glasses twinkling. It took Diggory much longer than that, and that was with her awake, too. Myrtle jerked her head toward the mermaid with an expression of great dislike on her glum face, giggling and showing off and flashing her fins. That's it, isn't it? Said Harry excitedly. The second task's to go and find the mer-people in the lake. But he suddenly realized what he was saying, and he felt the excitement drain out of him as though someone had just pulled the plug in his stomach. He wasn't a very good swimmer. He'd never had much practice. Dudley had had lessons in his youth, but Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, no doubt hoping that Harry would drown one day, hadn't bothered to give him any. A couple of lengths of his bath were all very well, but that lake was very large and very deep, and mer-people would surely live right at the bottom. Myrtle, Harry said slowly, how am I supposed to breathe? At this, Myrtle's eyes filled with sudden tears again. Tactless, she muttered, groping in her robes for a handkerchief. What's tactless? Said Harry, bewildered. Talking about breathing in front of me, she said shrilly, and her voice echoed loudly around the bathroom. When I can't, when I haven't, not for ages. She buried her face in her handkerchief and sniffed loudly. Harry remembered how touchy Myrtle had always been about being dead, but none of the other ghosts he knew made such a fuss about it. Sorry, he said impatiently. I didn't mean, I just forgot. Oh yes, very easy to forget Myrtle's dead, said Myrtle, gulping, looking at him out of swollen eyes. Nobody missed me even when I was alive. Took them hours and hours to find my body. I know, I was sitting there waiting for them. Olive Hornby came into the bathroom. Are you in here again? Skulking Myrtle, she said, because Professor Dipp had asked me to look for you. And then she saw my body. Oh, she didn't forget it until her dying day. I made sure of that. Followed her around and reminded her I did. I remember at her brother's wedding. But Harry wasn't listening. He was thinking about the mer-people's song again. We've taken what you'll sorely miss. That sounded as though he were going to steal something of his, something he had to get back. What were they going to take? And then, of course, she went to the Ministry of Magic to stop me stalking her, so I had to come back here and live in my toilet. Good, said Harry vaguely. Well, I'm a lot further on than I was. Shut your eyes again, will you? I'm getting out. He retrieved the egg from the bottom of the bath, climbed out, dried himself, and pulled on his pajamas and dressing gown again. Will you come and visit me in my bathroom again sometime? Moaning Myrtle asked mournfully as Harry picked up the invisibility cloak. I'll try, Harry said, though privately thinking the only way he'd be visiting Myrtle's bathroom again was if every other toilet in the castle got blocked. See you, Myrtle. Thanks for your help. Bye-bye, she said gloomily, and as Harry put on the invisibility cloak, he saw her zoom back up the tap. Out in the dark corridor, Harry examined the Marauder's map to check that the coast was still clear. Yes, the dots belonging to Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris, were safely in their office. Nothing else seemed to be moving apart from Peeves, though he was bouncing around the trophy room on the floor above. Harry had taken his first step back toward Gryffindor Tower when something else on the map caught his eye, something distinctly odd. Peeves was not the only thing that was moving. A single dot was flitting around a room in the bottom left-hand corner, Snape's office, but the dot wasn't labeled Severus Snape. It was Bartimaeus Crouch. Harry stared at the dot. Mr. Crouch was supposed to be too ill to go to work or to come to the Yule Ball, so what was he doing sneaking into Hogwarts at 1 o'clock in the morning? Harry watched closely as the dot moved around and around the room, pausing here and there. Harry hesitated, thinking, and then his curiosity got the better of him. He turned and set off in the opposite direction toward the nearest staircase. He was going to see what Crouch was up to. Harry walked down the stairs as quietly as possible, though the faces in some of the portraits still turned curiously at the squeak of a floorboard, the rustle of his pajamas. He crept along the corridor below, pushed aside a tapestry about halfway along, and proceeded down a narrow staircase, a shortcut that would take him down 2 floors. He kept glancing down at the map, wondering. It just didn't seem in character somehow for correct, law-abiding Mr. Crouch to be sneaking around somebody else's office this late at night. And then, halfway down the staircase, not thinking about what he was doing, not concentrating on anything but the peculiar behavior of Mr. Crouch, Harry's leg suddenly sank right through the trip step Neville always forgot to jump. He gave an ungainly wobble, and the golden egg, still damp from the bath, slipped from under his arm. He lurched forward to try and catch it, but too late. The egg fell down the long staircase with a bang as loud as a bass drum on every step. The invisibility cloak slipped. Harry snatched it, and the Marauder's map fluttered out of his hand and slid down 6 stairs, where sunk in the step to above his knee. He couldn't reach it. The golden egg fell through the tapestry at the bottom of the staircase, burst open, and began wailing loudly in the corridor below. Harry pulled out his wand and struggled to touch the Marauder's map to wipe it blank, but it was too far away to reach. Pulling the cloak back over himself, Harry straightened up, listening hard with his eyes screwed up with fear, and almost immediately, Peeves! It was the unmistakable hunting cry of Filch, the caretaker. Harry could hear his rapid, shuffling footsteps coming nearer and nearer, his wheezing voice raised in fury. "What's this racket? Wake up the whole castle, will you? I'll have you, Peeves. I'll have you. You'll... Wait. Oh, and what is this?" Filch's footsteps halted. There was a clink of metal on metal, and the wailing stopped. Filch had picked up the egg and closed it. Harry stood very still, one leg still jammed tightly in the magical step, listening. Any moment now, Filch was going to pull aside the tapestry, expecting to see Peeves, and there would be no Peeves. But if he came up the stairs, he would spot the Marauder's map, and invisibility cloak or not, the map would show Harry Potter standing exactly where he was. "Egg?" Filch said quietly at the foot of the stairs. "My sweet, Mrs. Norris was obviously with him. This is a Triwizard clue. This belongs to a school champion." Harry felt sick. His heart was hammering very fast. "Peeves!" Filch roared gleefully. "You've been stealing." He ripped back the tapestry below, and Harry saw his horrible pouchy face and bulging pale eyes staring up the dark and, to Filch, deserted staircase. "Hiding, are you?" he said softly. "I'm coming to get you, Peeves. You've gone and stolen a Triwizard clue." "Peeves, Dumbledore will have you out of here for this, you filthy, pilfering poltergeist." Filch started to climb the stairs, his scrawny, dust-colored cat at his heels. Mrs. Norris's lamp-like eyes, so very like her master's, were fixed directly upon Harry. He had had occasion before now to wonder whether the invisibility cloak worked on cats. Sick with apprehension, he watched Filch drawing nearer and nearer in his old flannel dressing-gown. He tried desperately to pull his trapped leg free, but it merely sank a few more inches. Any second now, Filch was going to spot the map or walk right into him. "Filch, what's going on?" Filch stopped a few steps below Harry and turned. At the foot of the stairs stood the only person who could make Harry's situation worse, Snape. He was wearing a long gray nightshirt, and he looked livid. "It's Peeves, Professor," Filch whispered malevolently. "He threw this egg down the stairs." Snape climbed up the stairs quickly and stopped beside Filch. Harry gritted his teeth, convinced his loudly thumping heart would give him away at any second. "Peeves?" said Snape, softly staring at the egg in Filch's hand. "But Peeves couldn't get into my office." "This egg was in your office, Professor?" "Of course not," Snape snapped. "I heard banging and wailing." "Yes, Professor, that was the egg. I was coming to investigate. Peeves threw it, Professor, and when I passed my office I saw that the torches were lit and the cupboard door was ajar. Somebody has been searching it. But Peeves couldn't—" "I know we couldn't, Filch," Snape snapped again. "I seal my office with a spell none but a wizard could break." Snape looked up the stairs, straight through Harry, and then down into the corridor below. "I want you to come and help me search for the intruder, Filch." Yes, Professor, but..." Filch looked yearningly up the stairs, right through Harry, who could see that he was very reluctant to forego the chance of cornering Peeves. "Go," Harry pleaded with him silently. "Go with Snape. Go." Mrs. Norris was peering around Filch's legs. Harry had the distinct impression that she could smell him. Why had he filled that bath with so much perfumed foam? "The thing is, Professor," said Filch plaintively, "the headmaster will have to listen to me this time. Peeves has been stealing from a student, and it might be my chance to get him thrown out of the castle once and for all." "Filch, I don't give a damn about that wretched poltergeist. It's my office that's—" Clunk, clunk, clunk. Snape stopped talking very abruptly. He and Filch both looked down at the foot of the stairs. Harry saw Mad-Eye Moody limp into sight through the narrow gap between their heads. Moody was wearing his old traveling cloak over his nightshirt and leaning on his staff, as usual. "Pajama party, is it?" he growled up the stairs. "Professor Snape and I heard noises, Professor," said Filch at once. "Peeves the poltergeist throwing things around as usual, and then Professor Snape discovered that someone had broken into his Shut up, Snape hissed to Filch. Moody took a step closer to the foot of the stairs. Harry saw Moody's magical eye travel over Snape and then unmistakably onto himself. Harry's heart gave a horrible jolt. Moody could see through invisibility cloaks. He alone could see the full strangeness of the scene. Snape in his nightshirt, Filch clutching the egg, and he, Harry, trapped in the stairs behind them, Moody's lopsided gash of a mouth open in surprise. For a few seconds he and Harry stared straight into each other's eyes. Then Moody closed his mouth and turned his blue eyes upon Snape again. Did I hear that correctly, Snape? He asked slowly. Someone broke into your office? It is unimportant, said Snape coldly. On the contrary, growled Moody, it is very important. Who'd want to break into your office? A student, I dare say, said Snape. Harry could see a vein flickering horribly on Snape's greasy temple. It has happened before. Potion ingredients have gone missing from my private store cupboard. Students attempting illicit mixtures, no doubt. Reckon they were after potion ingredients, eh? Said Moody. Not hiding anything else in your office, are you? Harry saw the edge of Snape's sallow face turn a nasty brick color, and then the vein in his temple pulsing more rapidly. You know I'm hiding nothing, Moody, he said in a soft and dangerous voice, as you've searched my office pretty thoroughly yourself. Moody's face twisted into a smile. Auror's privilege, Snape. Dumbledore told me to keep an eye. Dumbledore happens to trust me, said Snape through clenched teeth. I refuse to believe they gave you orders to search my office. Course Dumbledore trusts you, Moody growled. He's a trusting man, isn't he? Believes in second chances. But me, I say there are spots that don't come off, Snape. Spots that never come off. Do you know what I mean? Snape suddenly did something very strange. He seized his left forearm convulsively with his right hand, as though something on it had hurt him. Moody laughed. Get back to bed, Snape. You don't have the authority to send me anywhere, Snape hissed, letting go of his arm as though angry with himself. I have as much right to prowl this school after dark as you do. Prowl away, said Moody, but his voice was full of menace. I look forward to meeting you in the dark corridor sometime. You've dropped something, by the way. With a stab of horror, Harry saw Moody point at the Marauder's map, still lying on the staircase 6 steps below him. As Snape and Filch both turned to look at it, Harry threw caution to the winds. He raised his arms under the cloak and waved furiously at Moody to attract his attention, mouthing, It's mine. Mine. Snape had reached out for it, a horrible expression of dawning comprehension on his face. Accio, parchment. The map flew up into the air, clipped through Snape's outstretched fingers, and soared down the stairs into Moody's hand. My mistake, Moody said calmly. It's mine. Must have dropped it earlier. But Snape's black eyes were darting from the egg in Filch's arms to the map in Moody's hand, and Harry could tell he was putting two and two together, as only Snape could. Potter, he said quietly. What's that? Said Moody calmly, folding up the map and pocketing it. Potter, Snape snarled, and he actually turned his head and stared right at the place where Harry was, as though he could suddenly see him. That egg is Potter's egg. That piece of parchment belongs to Potter. I have seen it before. I recognize it. Potter is here. Potter in his invisibility cloak. Snape stretched out his hands like a blind man and began to move up the stairs. Harry could have sworn his overlarge nostrils were dilating, trying to sniff Harry out. Trapped. Harry leaned backward, trying to avoid Snape's fingertips, but any moment now. There's nothing there, Snape, barked Moody, but I'll be happy to tell the headmaster how quickly your mind jumped to Harry Potter. Meaning what? Snape turned again to look at Moody, his hand still outstretched, inches from Harry's chest. Meaning that Dumbledore's very interested to know who's got it in for that boy, said Moody, limping nearer still to the foot of the stairs. And so am I, Snape. Very interested. The torchlight flickered across his mangled face so that the scars and the chunk missing from his nose looked deeper and darker than ever. Snape was looking down at Moody, and Harry couldn't see the expression on his face. For a moment, nobody moved or said anything. Then Snape slowly lowered his hands. I merely thought, said Snape in a voice of forced calm, that if Potter was wandering around after hours again, it's an unfortunate habit of his, he should be stopped. For his own safety. Ah, I see, said Moody softly. Got Potter's best interests at heart, have you? There was a pause. Snape and Moody were still staring at each other. Mrs. Norris gave a loud meow, still peering around Filch's legs, looking for the source of Harry's bubble bath smell. I think I will go back to bed, Snape said curtly. Best idea you've had all night, said Moody. Now, Filch, if you'll just give me that egg. No, said Filch, clutching the egg as though it were his firstborn son. Professor Moody, this is evidence of Peeves' treachery. It's the property of the champion he stole it from, said Moody. Hand it over now. Snape swept downstairs and past Moody without another word. Filch made a chirruping noise to Mrs. Norris, who stared blankly at Harry for a few more seconds before turning and following her master. Still breathing very fast, Harry heard Snape walking away down the corridor. Filch handed Moody the egg and disappeared from view too, muttering to Mrs. Norris, "Never mind, my sweet. We'll see Dumbledore in the morning. Tell him what Peeves was up to." A door slammed. Harry was left staring down at Moody, who placed his staff on the bottommost stair and started to climb laboriously toward him, a dull clunk on every other step. "Close shave, Potter," he muttered. "Yeah, thanks," said Harry weakly. "What is this thing?" said Moody, drawing the Marauder's map out of his pocket and unfolding it. "Map of Hogwarts," said Harry, hoping Moody was going to pull him out of the staircase soon. His leg was really hurting him. "Merlin's beard," Moody whispered, staring at the map, his magical eye going haywire. This is some map, Potter." "Yeah, it's quite useful," Harry said. His eyes were starting to water from the pain. "Professor Moody, do you think you could help me?" "What? Oh, yes, of course." Moody took hold of Harry's arm and pulled. Harry's leg came free of the trick step, and he climbed onto the one above it. Moody was still gazing at the map. "Potter," he said slowly, "you didn't happen by any chance to see who broke into Snape's office, did you? On this map, I mean." Yeah, I did," Harry admitted. "It was Mr. Crouch." Moody's magical eye whizzed over the entire surface of the map, and he looked suddenly alarmed. "Crouch," he said. You're sure, Potter?" "Positive," said Harry. "Well, he's not here any more," said Moody, his eyes still whizzing over the map. "Crouch. That's very, very interesting." He said nothing for almost a minute, still staring at the map. Harry could tell that this news meant something to Moody, and very much wanted to know what it was. He wondered whether he dared ask. Moody scared him slightly, yet Moody had just helped him avoid an awful lot of trouble. "Professor Moody, why do you reckon Mr. Crouch wanted to look around Snape's office?" Moody's magical eye left the map and fixed, quivering, upon Harry. It was a penetrating glare, and Harry had the impression that Moody was sizing him up, wondering whether to answer or not, or how much to tell him. "Put it this way, Potter," Moody muttered finally. "They say old Mad Eye's obsessed with catching dark wizards, but I'm nothing compared to Barty Crouch." He continued to stare at the map. Harry was burning to know more. "Professor Moody," he said again, "do you think, could this have anything to do with, maybe Mr. Crouch thinks there's something going on?" "Like what?" said Moody sharply. Harry wondered how much he dare say. He didn't want Moody to guess that he had a source of information outside Hogwarts that might lead to tricky questions about Sirius. "I don't know," Harry muttered. "Odd stuff's been happening lately, hasn't it? It's been in the Daily Prophet, the Dark Mark at the World Cup, the Death Eaters and everything." Both of Moody's mismatched eyes widened. "You're a sharp boy, Potter," he said. His magical eye roved back to the Marauder's map. "Crouch could be thinking along those lines," he said slowly. "Very possible. There have been some funny rumors flying around lately, helped along by Rita Skeeter, of course. It's making a lot of people nervous, I reckon." A grim smile twisted his lopsided mouth. "Oh, if there's one thing I hate," he muttered, more to himself than to Harry, and his magical eye was fixed on the left-hand corner of the map. "It's a Death Eater who walked free." Harry stared at him. Could Moody possibly mean what Harry thought he meant? "And now I want to ask you a question, Potter," said Moody in a more businesslike tone. Harry's heart sank. He had thought this was coming. Moody was going to ask where he had got this map, which was a very dubious magical object, and the story of how it had fallen into his hands incriminated not only him, but his own father, Fred and George Weasley, and Professor Lupin, their last defense against the dark arts teacher. Moody waved the map in front of Harry, who braced himself. "Can I borrow this?" "Oh," said Harry. He was very fond of his map, but on the other hand he was extremely relieved that Moody wasn't asking where he'd got it, and there was no doubt that he owed Moody a favor. Yeah, okay." "Good boy," growled Moody. "I can make good use of this. This might be exactly what I've been looking for." "Right, bed, Potter. Come on now." They climbed to the top of the stairs together, Moody still examining the map as though it was a treasure, the like of which he had never seen before. They walked in silence to the door of Moody's office, where he stopped and looked up at Harry. "You ever thought of a career as an Auror, Potter?" "No," said Harry, taken aback. "You want to consider it," said Moody, nodding and looking at Harry thoughtfully. "Yes, indeed. And incidentally, I'm guessing you weren't just taking that egg for a walk tonight." "No," said Harry, grinning. "I've been working out the clue." Moody winked at him, his magical eye going haywire again. "Nothing like a nighttime stroll to give you ideas, Potter. See you in the morning." He went back into his office, staring down at the Marauder's map again, and closed the door behind him. Harry walked slowly back to Gryffindor Tower, lost in thought about Snape and Crouch, and what it all meant. Why was Crouch pretending to be ill if he could manage to get to Hogwarts when he wanted to? What did he think Snape was concealing in his office? And Moody thought Harry, ought to be an Auror. Interesting idea, but somehow, Harry thought, as he got quietly into his four-poster 10 minutes later, the egg and the cloak now safely back in his trunk, he thought he'd like to check how scared the rest of them were before he chose it as a career. How scarred, the rest of them were before he chose it as a career. Alright guys, we're going to read one more chapter because these chapters are very, very long. So we're going to read one more, and then we're going to call it there. So we're only going to be doing 3 chapters again on this one, because like I said, these are pretty long chapters. Chapter 27, The Second Task. You said you'd already worked out that egg clue, said Hermione indignantly. Keep your voice down, said Harry crossly. I just need to sort of fine-tune it, all right? He, Ron, and Hermione were sitting at the very back of the charms class with the table to themselves. They were supposed to be practicing the opposite of the summoning charm today, the banishing charm. Owing to the potential for nasty accidents when objects kept flying across the room, Professor Flitwick had given each student a stack of cushions on which to practice, the theory being that this wouldn't hurt anyone if they went off target. It was a good theory, but it wasn't working very well. Neville's aim was so poor that he kept accidentally sending much heavier things flying across the room. Professor Flitwick, for instance. Just forget the egg for a minute, all right? Harry hissed as Professor Flitwick went whizzing resignedly past them, landing on top of a large cabinet. I'm trying to tell you about Snape and Moody. This class was an ideal cover for a private conversation, as everyone was having far too much fun to pay them any attention. Harry had been recounting his adventures of the previous night in whispered installments for the last half hour. Snape said Moody searched his office as well. Ron whispered, his eyes alight with interest as he banished a cushion with a sweep of his wand. It soared into the air and knocked Pavarti's hat off. What do you reckon Moody's here to keep an eye on, Snape, as well as Karkaroff? Well, I don't know if that's what Dumbledore asked him to do, but he's definitely doing it, said Harry, waving his wand without paying much attention, so that his cushion did an odd sort of belly flop over the desk. Moody said Dumbledore only let Snape stay here because he's giving him a second chance or something. What? Said Ron, his eyes widening as next cushion spinning high into the air, ricocheting off the chandelier and dropping heavily onto Flitwick's desk. Harry, maybe Moody thinks Snape put your name in the Goblet of Fire. Oh, Ron, said Hermione, shaking her head skeptically. We thought Snape was trying to kill Harry before, and it turned out he was saving Harry's life, remember? She banished a cushion and it flew across the room and landed in the box they were all supposed to be aiming at. Harry looked at Hermione, thinking it was true that Snape had saved his life once, but the odd thing was, Snape definitely loathed him, just as he'd loathed Harry's father and when they had been at school together. Snape loved taking points from Harry, and he had certainly never missed an opportunity to give him punishments, or even to suggest that he should be suspended from the school. I don't care what Moody says, Hermione went on. Dumbledore's not stupid. He was right to trust Hagrid and Professor Lupin, even though loads of people wouldn't have given them jobs. So why shouldn't he be right about Snape, even if Snape is a bit evil? Said Ron promptly. Come on, Hermione. Why are all these dark wizard catchers searching his office, then? Why has Mr. Crouch been pretending to be ill? Said Hermione, ignoring Ron. It's a bit funny, isn't it, that he can't manage to come to the Yule Ball, but he can get up here in the middle of the night when he wants to? You just don't like Crouch because of that elf Winky, said Ron, sending a cushion soaring into the window. You just want to think Snape's up to something, said Hermione, sending her cushion zooming neatly into the box. I just want to know what Snape did with his first chance. If he's on his second one, said Harry grimly, and his cushion, to his very great surprise, flew straight across the room and landed neatly on top of Hermione's. Obedient to Sirius's wish of hearing about anything odd at Hogwarts, Harry sent him a letter by Bron Owl that night explaining all about Mr. Crouch breaking into Snape's office and Moody at Snape's conversation. Then Harry turned his attention in earnest to the most urgent problem facing him, how to survive underwater for an hour on the 24th of February. Ron quite liked the idea of using the summoning charm again. Harry had explained about aqualungs, and Ron couldn't see why Harry shouldn't summon one from the nearest Muggle town. Hermione squashed this plan by pointing out that in the unlikely event that Harry managed to learn how to operate an aqualung within the set limit of an hour, he was sure to be disqualified for breaking the International Code of Wizarding Secrecy. It was too much to hope that no muggles would spot an aqualung zooming across the countryside to Hogwarts. Of course, the ideal solution would be for you to transfigure yourself into a submarine or something. Hermione said, if only we'd done human transfiguration already. But I don't think we start that until 6th year, and it can go badly wrong if you don't know what you're doing. Yeah, I don't fancy walking around with a periscope sticking out of my head, said Harry. I suppose I could always attack someone in front of Moody. He might do it for me. I don't think he'd let you choose what you wanted to be turned into, though, said Hermione seriously. No, I think your best chance is some sort of charm. So Harry, thinking that he would soon have had enough of the library to last him a lifetime, buried himself once more among the dusty volumes, looking for any spell that might enable a human to survive without oxygen. However, though, he, Ron, and Hermione searched through their lunchtimes, evenings, and whole weekends. Though Harry asked Professor McGonagall for a note of permission to use the restricted section, and even asked the irritable, vulture-like librarian, Madame Pince, for help, they found nothing whatsoever that would enable Harry to spend an hour underwater and live to tell the tale. Familiar flutterings of panic were starting to disturb Harry now, and he was finding it difficult to concentrate in class again. The lake, which Harry had always taken for granted as just another feature of the grounds, drew his eyes whenever he was near a classroom window, a great iron-gray mass of chilly water, whose dark and icy depths were starting to seem as distant as the moon. Just as it had before he faced the Horntail, time was slipping away as though somebody had bewitched the clocks to go extra fast. There was a week to go before February the 24th. There was still time. There were 5 days to go. He was bound to find something soon. 3 days to go. Please let me find something. Please. With 2 days left, Harry started to go off food again. The only good thing about breakfast on Monday was the return of the brown owl he had sent to Sirius. He pulled off the parchment, unrolled it, and saw the shortest letter Sirius had ever written to him. Send date of next Hogsmeade weekend by return owl. Harry turned the parchment over and looked at the back, hoping to see something else, but it was blank. Weekend after next, whispered Hermione, who had read the note over Harry's shoulder. Here, take my quill and send this owl back straight away. Harry scribbled the dates down on the back of Sirius's letter, tied it onto the brown owl's leg, and watched it take flight again. What had he expected? Advice on how to survive underwater? He had been so intent on telling Sirius all about Snape and Moody, he had completely forgotten to mention the egg's clue. What's he want to know about the next Hogsmeade weekend for? Said Ron. Dunno, said Harry dully. The momentary happiness that had flared inside him at the sight of the owl had died. Come on, care of magical creatures. Whether Hagrid was trying to make up for the blast-ended Scroots, or because there were now only 2 Scroots left, or because he was trying to prove he could do anything that Professor Grubbly Plank could, Harry didn't know, but Hagrid had been continuing our lessons on unicorns ever since he'd returned to work. It turned out that Hagrid knew quite as much about unicorns as he did about monsters, though it was clear that he found their lack of poisonous fangs disappointing. Today he had managed to capture 2 unicorn foals. Unlike full-grown unicorns, they were pure gold. Pavarti and Lavender went into transports of delight at the sight of them, and even Pansy Parkinson had to work hard to conceal how much she had liked them. Easier to spot than the adults, Hagrid told the class. They turn silver when they're about 2 years old, and they grow horns at around 4. Don't go pure white till they're full grown, around about 7. They're a bit more trusting when they're babies. Don't mind boys so much. Come on, move in a bit. You can pet 'em if you want. Give 'em a few of these sugar lumps. You okay, Harry? Hagrid muttered, moving aside slightly while most of the others swarmed around the baby unicorns. Yeah, said Harry. Just nervous, eh? Said Hagrid. Bit, said Harry. Harry, said Hagrid, clapping a massive hand on his shoulder so that Harry's knees buckled under its weight. I'd have been worried before I saw you take on that Horntail, but I know you can do anything you set your mind to. I'm not worried at all. You're going to be fine. Got your clue worked out, haven't you? Harry nodded, but even as he did so, an insane urge to confess that he didn't have any idea how to survive at the bottom of the lake for an hour came over him. He looked up at Hagrid. Perhaps he had to go into the lake sometimes to deal with the creatures in it. He looked after everything else on the grounds, after all. You're going to win, Hagrid growled, patting Harry's shoulder again, so that Harry actually felt himself sink a couple of inches into the soft ground. I know it. I can feel it. You're going to win, Harry. Harry just couldn't bring himself to wipe the happy, confident smile off Hagrid's face. Pretending he was interested in the young unicorns, he forced a smile in return and moved forward to pat them with the others. By the evening before the second task, Harry felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare. He was fully aware that even if, by some miracle, he managed to find a suitable spell, he'd have a real job mastering it overnight. How could he have let this happen? Why hadn't he got to work on the egg's clue sooner? Why had he never let his mind wander in class? What if a teacher had once mentioned how to breathe underwater? He sat with Hermione and Ron in the library as the sun set outside, tearing feverishly through page after page of spells, hidden from one another by the massive piles of books on the desk in front of each other. Harry's heart gave a huge leap every time he saw the word water on a page, but more often than not it was merely take 2 pints of water, half a pound of shredded mandrake leaves, and a newt. I don't reckon it can be done, said Ron's voice flatly from the other side of the table. There's nothing. Nothing. The closest was that thing to dry up puddles and ponds, that drought charm, but that was nowhere near powerful enough to drain the lake. There must be something, Hermione muttered, moving a candle close to her. Her eyes were so tired she was poring over the tiny print of old and forgotten bewitchments and charms, with her nose about an inch from the page. They'd never have set a task that was undoable. They have, said Ron. Harry, just go down to the lake tomorrow, right? Stick your head in, yell at the mer people to give back whatever they've nicked, and see if they chuck it out. Best you can do, mate. There's a way of doing it, Hermione said crossly. There just has to be. She seemed to be taking the library's lack of useful information on the subjects as a personal insult. It had never failed her before. I know what I should have done, said Harry, resting face down on saucy tricks for tricky sorts. I should have learned to be an animagus like Sirius. An animagus was a wizard who could transform into an animal. Yeah, you could have turned into a goldfish any time you wanted, said Ron, or a frog, yawned Harry. He was exhausted. It takes years to become an animagus, and then you have to register yourself and everything, said Hermione, vaguely, now squinting down the index of weird wizarding dilemmas and their solutions. Professor McGonagall told us, remember? You've got to register yourself with the improper use of magical office, what animal you become, and your markings, so you can't abuse it. Hermione, I was joking, said Harry wearily. I know I haven't got a chance of turning into a frog by tomorrow morning. Oh, this is no use, said Hermione, snapping shut weird wizarding dilemmas. Who on earth wants to make their nose hair grow into ringlets? I wouldn't mind, said Fred Weasley's voice. Be a talking point, wouldn't it? Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked up. Fred and George had just emerged from behind some bookshelves. What are you two doing here? Ron asked. Looking for you, said George. McGonagall wants you, Ron, and you, Hermione. Why? Said Hermione, looking surprised. Dunno, she was looking a bit grim, though, said Fred. We're supposed to take you down to her office, said George. Ron and Hermione stared at Harry, who felt his stomach drop. Was Professor McGonagall about to tell Ron and Hermione off? Perhaps she'd noticed how much they were helping him when he ought to be working on how to do the task alone. We'll meet you back in the common room, Hermione told Harry as she got up to go with Ron. Both of them looked very anxious. Bring as many of these books as you can, okay? Right, said Harry uneasily. By 8 o'clock, Madame Pince had extinguished all the lamps and came to chivvy Harry out of the library. Staggering under the weight of as many books as he could carry, Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room, pulled the table into a corner, and continued to search. There was nothing in Madcap Magic for Wacky Warlocks, nothing in A Guide to Medieval Sorcery, not one mention of underwater deep exploits in an anthology of 18th century charms, or in Dreadful Denizens of the Deep, or powers you never knew you had and what to do with them now you've wised up. Crookshanks crawled into Harry's lap and curled up, purring deeply. The common room emptied slowly around Harry. People kept wishing him luck for the next morning in cheery, confident voices like Hagrid's, all of them apparently convinced that he was about to pull off another stunning performance like the one he had managed in the first task. Harry couldn't answer them. He just nodded, feeling as though there were a golf ball stuck in his throat. By 10 to midnight, he was alone in the room with Crookshanks. He had searched all the remaining books, and Ron and Hermione had not come back. It's over, he told himself. You can't do it. You'll just have to go down to the lake in the morning and tell the judges. He imagined himself explaining that he couldn't do the task. He pictured Bagman's look of round-eyed surprise, Karkaroff's satisfied, yellow-toothed smile. He could almost hear Fleur Delacour saying, I knew it. He's too young. He's only a little boy. He saw Malfoy flashing his Potter Stinks badge at the front of the crowd, saw Hagrid's crestfallen, disbelieving face. Forgetting that Crookshanks was on his lap, Harry stood up very suddenly. Crookshanks hissed angrily as he landed on the floor, gave Harry a disgusted look, and stalked away with his bottle-brush tail in the air. But Harry was already hurrying up the spiral staircase to his dormitory. He would grab the invisibility cloak and go back to the library. He'd stay there all night if he had to. Lumos, Harry whispered 15 minutes later as he opened the library door. Wand tip alight, he crept along the bookshelves, pulling down more books. Books of hexes and charms, books on merpeople and water monsters, books on famous witches and wizards, on magical inventions, on anything at all that might include one passing reference to underwater survival. He carried them over to a table, then set to work searching them by the narrow beam of his wand, occasionally checking his watch. 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. The only way he could keep going was to tell himself over and over again, next book, in the next one, the next one. The mermaid in the painting in the prefect's bathroom was laughing. Harry was bobbing like a cork in bubbly water next to her rock while she held his firebolt over his head. Come and get it, she giggled maliciously. Come on, jump. I can't, Harry panted, snatching at the firebolt and struggling not to sink. Give it to me. But she just poked him painfully on the side with the end of the broomstick, laughing at him. That hurts. Get off. Ouch. Harry Potter must wake up, sir. Stop poking me. Dumbledore must poke Harry Potter, sir. He must wake up. Harry opened his eyes. He was still in the library. The invisibility cloak had slipped off his head as he had slept, and the side of his face was stuck to the pages of Where There's a Wand, There's a Way. He sat up, straightening his glasses, blinking in the bright daylight. Harry Potter needs to hurry, squeaked Dobby. The second task starts in 10 minutes. And Harry Potter... 10 minutes? Harry croaked. 10 minutes? He looked down at his watch. Dobby was right. It was 9:20. A large dead weight seemed to fall through Harry's chest into his stomach. Hurry, Harry Potter, squeaked Dobby, plucking at Harry's sleeve. You was supposed to be down by the lake with the other champions, sir. It's too late, Dobby, Harry said hopelessly. I'm not doing the task. I don't know how. Harry Potter will do the task, squeaked the elf. Dobby knew Harry had not found the right book, so Dobby did it for him. What? Said Harry. But you don't know what the second task is. Dobby knows, sir. Harry Potter has to go into the lake and find his Wheezy. Find my what? And take his Wheezy back from the mer people. What's a Wheezy? Your Wheezy, sir. Your Wheezy. Wheezy who is giving Dobby his sweater. Dobby plucked at the shrunken maroon sweater he was now wearing over his shorts. What? Harry gasped. They've got Ron? The thing Harry Potter will miss most, sir, squeaked Dobby. But past an hour. The prospect's black, Harry recited, staring horror-struck at the elf. Too late, it's gone. It won't come back. Dobby, what have I got to do? You has to eat this, sir, squeaked the elf, and he put his hand in the pocket of his shorts and drew out a ball of what looked like slimy grayish-green rat tails. Right before you go into the lake, sir. Gillyweed. What's it do? Said Harry, staring at the gillyweed. It will make Harry Potter breathe underwater, sir. Dobby, said Harry frantically, listen, are you sure about this? He couldn't quite forget that the last time Dobby had tried to help him, he had ended up with no bones in his right arm. Dobby is quite sure, sir, said the elf earnestly. Dobby hears things, sir. He is a house elf. He goes all over the castle as he lights the fires and mops the floors. Dobby heard Professor McGonagall and Professor Moody in the staff room talking about the next task. Dobby cannot let Harry Potter lose his Wheezy. Harry's doubts vanished. Jumping to his feet, he pulled off the invisibility cloak, stuffed it into his bag, grabbed the gillyweed and put it into his pocket, then tore out of the library with Dobby at his heels. Dobby is supposed to be in the kitchen, sir, Dobby squealed. As they burst into the corridor, Dobby will be missed. Good luck, Harry Potter. Sir, good luck. See you later, Dobby, Harry shouted, and he sprinted along the corridor and down the stairs, 3 at a time. The entrance hall contained a few last-minute stragglers, all leaving the great hall after breakfast and heading through the double oak doors to watch the second task. They stared as Harry flashed past, sending Colin and Dennis Creevey flying as he leapt down the stone steps and out into the bright, chilly grounds. As he pounded down the lawn, he saw that the seats that had encircled the dragon's enclosure in November were now ranged along the opposite bank, rising in stands that were packed to the bursting point and reflected in the lake below. The excited babble of the crowd echoed strangely across the water as Harry ran flat out around the other side of the lake toward the judges, who were sitting at another gold-draped table at the water's edge. Cedric, Fleur, and Crumb were beside the judges' table, watching Harry sprint toward them. I'm here, Harry panted, skidding to a halt in the mud and accidentally splattering Fleur's robes. Where have you been? Said a bossy, disapproving voice. The task's about to start. Harry looked around. Percy Weasley was sitting at the judges' table. Mr. Crouch had failed to turn up again. Now, Percy, said little Bagman, who was looking intensely relieved to see Harry. Let him catch his breath. Dumbledore smiled at Harry, but Karkaroff and Madame Maxim didn't look at all pleased to see him. It was obvious from the looks on their faces that they had thought he wasn't going to turn up. Harry bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. He had a stitch in his side that felt as though he had a knife between his ribs, but there was no time to get rid of it. Leto Bagman was now moving among the champions, spacing them along the bank at intervals of 10 feet. Harry was on the very end of the line next to Crumb, who was wearing swimming trunks and was holding his wand ready. All right, Harry, Bagman whispered as he moved Harry a few feet farther away from Crumb. Know what you're going to do? Yeah, Harry panted, massaging his ribs. Bagman gave Harry's shoulder a quick squeeze and returned to the judge's table. He pointed his wand at his throat, as he had done at the World Cup, and said, Sonorous, and his voice boomed out across the dark water toward the stands. Well, all our champions are ready for the second task, which will start on my whistle. They have precisely an hour to recover what has been taken from them. On the count of 3, then. 1, 2, 3. The whistle echoed shrilly in the cold, still air. The stands erupted with cheers and applause, without looking to see what the other champions were doing. Harry pulled off his shoes and socks, pulled the handful of gillyweed out of his pocket, stuffed it into his mouth, and waded out into the lake. It was so cold he felt the skin on his legs searing as though this were fire, not icy water. His satin robes weighed him down as he walked in deeper. Now the water was over his knees, and mumbling his rapidly numbing feet were slipping over silt and flat, slimy stones. He was chewing the gillyweed as hard and as fast as he could. It felt unpleasantly slimy and rubbery, like octopus tentacles. Waist deep in the freezing water, he stopped, swallowed, and waited for something to happen. He could hear laughter in the crowd and knew he must look stupid, walking into the lake without showing any sign of magical power. The part of him that was still dry was covered in goose pimples. Half immersed in the icy water, a cruel breeze lifting his hair, Harry started to shiver violently. He avoided looking at the stands. The laughter was becoming louder, and there was catcalls and jeering from the Slytherins. Then, quite suddenly, Harry felt as though an invisible pillow had been pressed over his mouth and nose. He tried to draw breath, but it made his head spin. His lungs were empty, and he suddenly felt a piercing pain on either side of his neck. Harry clapped his hands around his throat and felt two large slits just below his ears flapping in the cold air. He had gills. Without pausing to think, he did the only thing that made sense. He flung himself forward into the water. The first gulp of icy lake water felt like the breath of life. His head had stopped spinning. He took another great gulp of water and felt it pass smoothly through his gills, sending oxygen back to his brain. He stretched out his hands in front of him and stared at them. They looked green and ghostly under the water, and they had become webbed. He twisted around and looked at his bare feet. They had become elongated, and the toes were webbed too. It looked as though he had sprouted flippers. The water didn't feel icy anymore either. On the contrary, he felt pleasantly cool and very light. Harry struck out once more, marveling at how far and fast his flipper-like feet propelled him through the water, and noticing how clearly he could see, and how he no longer seemed to need to blink. He had soon swum so far into the lake that he could no longer see the bottom. He flipped over and dived into its depths. Silence pressed upon his ears as he soared over a strange, dark, foggy landscape. He could only see 10 feet around him, so that as he sped through the water, new scenes seemed to loom suddenly out of the oncoming darkness. Forests of rippling, tangled black weed, wide plains of mud littered with dull, glimmering stones. He swam deeper and deeper out toward the middle of the lake, his eyes wide, staring through the eerie gray-lit water around him to the shadows beyond, where the water became opaque. See, you would never catch me swimming in that. I couldn't. I seriously could not swim in that because of the seaweed. Small fish flickered past him like silver darts. Once or twice he thought he saw something larger moving ahead of him, but when he got nearer he discovered it to be nothing but a large blackened log or a dense clump of weeds. There was no sign of any of the other champions, merpeople, Ron, nor thankfully the giant squid. Light green weeds stretched ahead of him as far as he could see, 2 feet deep, like a meadow of very overgrown grass. Harry was staring unblinkingly ahead of him, trying to discern shapes through the gloom, and then, without warning, something grabbed hold of his ankle. Harry twisted his body around and saw a Grindylow, a small horned water demon, poking out of the weed, its long fingers clutched tightly around Harry's leg, its pointed fangs bared. Harry stuck his webbed hand quickly inside his robes and fumbled for his wand. By the time he had grasped it, 2 more Grindylows had risen out of the weed, had seized handfuls of Harry's robe, and were attempting to drag him down. "Relatio," Harry shouted, except that no sound came out. A large bubble issued from his mouth, and his wand, instead of sending sparks at the Grindylows, pelted them with what seemed to be a jet of boiling water. For where it struck them, angry red patches appeared on their green skin. Harry pulled his ankle out of the Grindylow's grip and swam as fast as he could, occasionally sending more jets of hot water over his shoulder at random. Every now and then he felt one of the Grindylows snatch at his foot again, and he kicked out hard. Finally, he felt his foot connected with a horned skull, and looking back, he saw the dazed Grindylow floating away, cross-eyed, while its fellows shook their fists at Harry and sank back into the weed. Harry slowed down a little, slipped his wand back inside his robes, and looked around, listening again. He turned full circle in the water, the silence pressing harder than ever against his eardrums. He knew he must be even deeper in the lake now, but nothing was moving but the rippling weed. "How are you getting on?" Harry thought he was having a heart attack. He whipped around and saw Moaning Myrtle floating hazily in front of him, gazing at him through her thick pearly glasses. "Myrtle!" Harry tried to shout, but once again nothing came out of his mouth but a very large bubble. Moaning Myrtle actually giggled. "You want to try over there," she said, pointing. "I won't come with you. I don't like them much. They always chase me when I get too close." Harry gave her the thumbs up to show his thanks and set off once more, careful to swim a bit higher over the weed to avoid any more Grindylows that might be lurking there. He swam on for what felt like at least 20 minutes. He was passing over vast expanses of black mud now, which swirled murkily as he disturbed the water. Then at long last he heard a snatch of haunting mere song. An hour long you'll have to look, and to recover what we took. Harry swam faster and soon saw a large rock emerge out of the muddy water ahead. It had paintings of merpeople on it. They were carrying spears and chasing what looked like the giant squid. Harry swam on past the rock, following the mere song. Your time's half gone, so tarry not, lest what you seek stays here to rot. A cluster of crude stone dwellings stained with algae loomed suddenly out of the gloom on all sides. Here and there at the dark windows, Harry saw faces that bore no resemblance at all to the painting of the mermaid in the prefect's bathroom. The merpeople had grayish skin and long, wild, dark green hair. Their eyes were yellow, as were their broken teeth, and they wore the thick robes of pebbles around their necks. They leered at Harry as he swam past. One or two of them emerged from their caves to watch him better, their powerful silverfish tails beating the water, spears clutched in their hands. Harry sped on, staring around, and soon the dwellings became more numerous. There were gardens of weed around some of them, and he even saw a pet Grindylow tied to a stake outside one door. Merpeople were emerging on all sides now, watching him eagerly, pointing at his webbed hands and gills, talking behind their hands to one another. Harry sped around a corner, and a very strange sight met his eyes. A whole crowd of merpeople was floating in front of the houses that lined what looked like a mere version of a village square. A choir of merpeople were singing in the middle, calling the champions toward them, and behind them rose a crude sort of statue, a gigantic merperson hewn from a boulder. 4 people were bound tightly to the tail of the stone merperson. Ron was tied between Hermione and Cho Chang. There was also a girl who looked no older than 8, whose clouds of silvery hair made Harry feel sure that she was Fleur Delacour's sister. All 4 of them appeared to be in a very deep sleep. Their heads were lolling onto their sides, and fine streams of bubbles kept issuing from their mouths. Harry sped toward the hostages, half expecting the merpeople to lower their spears and charge at him. But they did nothing. The ropes of weed tying the hostages to the statue were thick, slimy, and very strong. For a fleeting second he thought of the knife Sirius had bought him for Christmas, locked in his trunk in the castle, a quarter of a mile away, no use to him whatsoever. He looked around. Many of the merpeople surrounding them were carrying spears. He swam swiftly toward a 7-foot-tall merman with a long green beard and a choker of shark fangs, and tried to mime a request to borrow the spear. The merman laughed and shook his head. "We do not help," he said in a harsh, croaky voice. "Come on," Harry said fiercely, but only bubbles issued from his mouth, and he tried to pull the spear away from the merman, but the merman yanked it back, still shaking his head and laughing. Harry swirled around, staring back. Something sharp, anything. There were rocks littering the lake bottom. He dived and snatched up a particularly jagged one and returned to the statue. He began to hack at the ropes binding Ron, and after several minutes' hard work, they broke apart. Ron floated unconscious a few inches above the lake bottom, drifting a little in the ebb of the water. Harry looked around. There was no sign of any of the other champions. What were they playing at? Why didn't they hurry up? He turned back to Hermione, raised the jagged rock, and began to hack at her bindings too. At once, several pairs of strong, gray hands seized him. 6 mermen were pulling him away from Hermione, shaking their green-haired heads and laughing. "You take your own hostage," one of them said to him. "Leave the others." "No way," said Harry furiously, but only 2 large bubbles came out. "Your task is to retrieve your own friend. Leave the others." "She's my friend, too," Harry yelled, gesturing toward Hermione. An enormous silver bubble emerging soundlessly from his lips, "and I don't want them to die either." Cho's head was on Hermione's shoulder. The small silver-haired girl was ghostly green and pale. Harry struggled to fight off the mermen, but they laughed harder than ever. Holding him back, Harry looked wildly around. Where were the other champions? Would he have time to take Ron to the surface and come back down for Hermione and the others? Would he be able to find them again? He looked down at his watch to see how much time was left, and it had stopped working. But then the merpeople around him pointed excitedly over his head. Harry looked up and saw Cedric swimming toward them. There was an enormous bubble around his head, which made his features look oddly wide and stretched. "Got lost," he mouthed, looking panic-stricken. "Floor and crumbs coming now." Feeling enormously relieved, Harry watched Cedric pull a knife out of his pocket and cut Cho free. He pulled her upward and out of sight. Harry looked around, waiting. Where were Fleur and Crumb? Time was getting short, and according to the song, the hostages would be lost after an hour. The merpeople started screeching animatedly. Those holding Harry loosened their grip, staring behind them. Harry turned and saw something monstrous cutting through the water toward them, a human body in swimming trunks with the head of a shark. It was Crumb. He appeared to have transfigured himself, but badly. The shark man swam straight to Hermione and began snapping and biting her ropes. The trouble was that Crumb's new teeth were positioned very awkwardly for biting anything smaller than a dolphin, and Harry was quite sure that if Crumb wasn't careful, he was going to rip Hermione in half. Darting forward, Harry hit Crumb hard on the shoulder and held up the jagged stone. Crumb seized it and began to cut Hermione free. Within seconds he had done it. He grabbed Hermione around the waist and without a backward glance began to rise rapidly with her toward the surface. Now what? Harry thought desperately. If he could be sure that Fleur was coming, but still no sign. There was nothing to be done except... He snatched up the stone which Crumb had dropped, but the mermen now closed in around Ron and the little girl, shaking their heads at him. Harry pulled out his wand. Get out of the way. Only bubbles flew out of his mouth, but he had the distinct impression that the mermen had understood him, because they suddenly stopped laughing. Their yellowish eyes were fixed upon Harry's wand, and they looked scared. There might be a lot more of them than there were of him, but Harry could tell by the looks on their faces that they knew no more magic than the giant squid did. You've got until 3, Harry shouted. A great stream of bubbles burst from him, but he held up 3 fingers to make sure they got the message. 1, he put down a finger. 2, he put down a second one. They scattered. Harry darted forward and began to hack at the ropes, binding the small girl to the statue, and at last she was free. He seized the little girl around the waist, grabbed the neck of Ron's robes, and kicked off from the bottom. It was very slow work. He could no longer use his webbed hands to propel himself forward. He worked his flippers furiously, but Ron and Fleur's sister were like potato-filled sacks, dragging him back down. He fixed his eyes skyward, though he knew he must still be very deep. The water above him was so dark. Merpeople were rising with him. He could see them swirling around him with ease, watching him struggle through the water. Would they pull him back down to the depths when the time was up? Did they perhaps eat humans? Harry's legs were seizing up with the effort to keep swimming. His shoulders were aching horribly with the effort of dragging Ron and the girl. He was drawing breath with extreme difficulty. He could feel pain on the sides of his neck again. He was becoming very aware of how wet the water was in his mouth. Yet the darkness was definitely thinning now. He could see daylight above him. He kicked hard with his flippers and discovered that they were nothing more than feet. Water was flooding through his mouth into his lungs. He was starting to feel dizzy, but he knew light and air were only 10 feet above him. He had to get there. He had to. Harry kicked his legs so hard and fast it felt as though his muscles were screaming in protest. His very brain felt waterlogged. He couldn't breathe. He needed oxygen. He had to keep going. He could not stop. And then he felt his head break the surface of the lake. Wonderful, cold, clear air was making his wet face sting. He gulped it down, feeling as though he had never breathed properly before, and panting, pulled Ron and the little girl up with him. All around him, wild, green-haired heads were emerging out of the water with him, but they were smiling at him. The crowd in the stands was making a great deal of noise, shouting and screaming. They all seemed to be on their feet. Harry had the impression they thought that Ron and the little girl might be dead, but they were wrong. Both of them had opened their eyes. The girl looked scared and confused, but Ron merely expelled a great spout of water, blinked in the bright light, turned to Harry and said, "Wet, this, isn't it?" Then he spouted Fleur's sister. "What did you bring her for?" "Fleur didn't turn up. I couldn't leave her," Harry panted. "Harry, you prat," said Ron. "You didn't take that song thing seriously, did you? Dumbledore wouldn't have let any of us drown." "The song said it was only to make sure you got back inside the time limit," said Ron. "I hope you didn't waste time down there acting the hero." Harry felt both stupid and annoyed. It was all very well for Ron. He'd been asleep. He hadn't felt how eerie it was down in the lake, surrounded by spear-carrying merpeople who hadn't looked more than capable of murder. "Come on," Harry said shortly. "Help me with her. I don't think she can swim very well." They pulled Fleur's sister through the water, back towards the bank where the judges stood watching, 20 merpeople accompanying them like a guard of honor, singing their horrible, screechy songs. Harry could see Madame Pomfrey fussing over Hermione, Crumb, Cedric, and Cho, all of whom were wrapped in thick blankets. Dumbledore and Leto Bagman stood beaming at Harry and Ron from the bank as they swam near, but Percy, who looked very white and somehow much younger than usual, came splashing out to meet them. Meanwhile, Madame Maxim was trying to restrain Fleur Delacour, who was quite hysterical, fighting tooth and nail to return to the water. Gabrielle, is she alive? Is she hurt?" "She's fine." Harry tried to tell her, but he was so exhausted he could hardly talk, let alone shout. Percy seized Ron and was dragging him back to the bank. "Get off, Percy, I'm all right." Dumbledore and Bagman were pulling Harry upright. Fleur had broken free of Madame Maxim and was hugging her sister. "It was the Grindylows. They attacked me. Oh, Gabrielle, I thought... "Come here, you," said Madame Pomfrey. She seized Harry and pulled him over to Hermione and the others, wrapped him so tightly in a blanket that he felt as though he were in a straitjacket, and forced a measure of very hot potion down his throat. Steam gushed out of his ears. "Harry, well done," Hermione cried. "You did it. You found out how all by yourself." "Well," said Harry. He would have told her about Dobby, but he had just noticed Karkaroff watching him. He was the only judge who had not left the table, the only judge not showing signs of pleasure and relief that Harry, Ron, and Flora's sister had got back safely. "Yeah, that's right," said Harry, raising his voice slightly so that Karkaroff could hear him. "You have a water beetle in your hair, Hermione," said Krum. Harry had the impression that Krum was drawing her attention back onto himself, perhaps to remind her that he had just rescued her from the lake. But Hermione brushed away the beetle impatiently and said, "You're well outside the time limit, though, Harry. Did it take you ages to find us?" "No, I found you okay." Harry's feeling of stupidity was growing. Now he was out of the water. It seemed perfectly clear that Dumbledore's safety precautions wouldn't have permitted the death of a hostage just because their champion hadn't turned up. Why hadn't he just grabbed Ron and gone? He would have been first back. Cedric and Krum hadn't wasted time worrying about anyone else. They hadn't taken the Mersong seriously. Dumbledore was crouching at the water's edge, deep in conversation with what seemed to be the chief merperson, a particularly wild and ferocious-looking female. He was making the same sort of screeching noises that the merpeople made when they were above water. Clearly, Dumbledore could speak Mermish. Finally, he straightened up, turned his fellow judges, and said, "A conference before we give the marks, I think." The judges went into a huddle. Madame Pomfrey had gone to rescue Ron from Percy's clutches. She led him over to Harry and the others, gave him a blanket and some pepper-up potion, then went to fetch Fleur and her sister. Fleur had many cuts on her face and arms, and her robes were torn, but she didn't seem to care, nor would she allow Madame Pomfrey to clean them. "Look after Gabrielle," she told her, and then she turned to Harry. "You saved her," she said breathlessly, "even though she was not your hostage." "Yeah," said Harry, who was now heartily wishing he'd left all three girls tied to the statue. Fleur bent down, kissed Harry twice on each cheek. He felt his face burn and wouldn't have been surprised if steam was coming out of his ears again, then said to Ron, "And you too. You helped." "Yeah," said Ron, looking extremely hopeful. "Yeah, a bit." Fleur swooped down on him too and kissed him. Hermione looked simply furious, but just then little Bagman's magically magnified voice boomed out beside them, making them all jump and causing the crowd in the stands to go very quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our decision. Merchieftainess Mercus has told us exactly what happened at the bottom of the lake, and we have therefore decided to award marks out of 50 for each of the champions as follows. Fleur Delacour, though she demonstrated excellent use of the bubblehead charm, was attacked by Grindylows as she approached her goal and failed to retrieve her hostage. We award her 25 points. Applause from the stands. "I deserved 0, said Fleur throatily, shaking her magnificent head. Cedric Diggory, oh Jesus, I tried to combine those words together, who also used the bubblehead charm, was first to return with his hostage, though he returned 1 minute outside the time limit of an hour." Enormous cheers from the Hufflepuffs in the crowd. Harry saw Cho give Cedric a glowing look. "We therefore award him 47 points. Harry's heart sank. If Cedric had been outside the time limit, he most certainly had been. Victor Krum used an incomplete form of transfiguration, which was nevertheless effective, and was second to return with his hostage. We award him 40 points. Karkaroff clapped particularly hard, looking very superior. Harry Potter used gillyweed to great effect, Bagman continued. He returned last and well outside the time limit of an hour. However, the Merchieftainess informs us that Mr. Potter was first to reach the hostages, and that the delay in his return was due to his determination to return all hostages to safety, not merely his own." Ron and Hermione both gave Harry half-exasperated, half-commiserating looks. Most of the judges, and here Bagman gave Karkaroff a very nasty look, feel that this shows more moral fiber and merits full marks. However, Mr. Potter's score is 45 points. Harry's stomach leapt. He was now tying for first place with Cedric. Ron and Hermione, caught by surprise, stared at Harry, then laughed and started applauding hard with the rest of the crowd. "There you go, Harry." Ron shouted over the noise. "You weren't being thick after all. You were showing moral fiber." Flora was clapping very hard too, but Crumb didn't look happy at all. He attempted to engage Hermione in conversation again, but she was too busy cheering Harry to listen. "The third and final task will take place at dusk on the 24th of June," continued Bagman. "The champions will be notified of what is coming precisely 1 month beforehand. Thank you all for your support of the champions." It was over. Harry thought dazedly as Madame Pomfrey began herding the champions and hostages back to the castle to get into dry clothes. It was over. He had got through. He didn't have to worry about anything now until June the 24th. Next time he was in Hogsmeade, Harry decided as he walked back up the stone steps into the castle, he was going to buy Dobby a pair of socks for every day of the year. Alright, guys. That is going to be it, because these chapters are literally like 30 pages long. The farther we go into this book. So that's going to be it for this one. We will pick up on chapter 27 the next time I read. So make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you guys think about it. What's happening. I mean, Harry did have some great bravery there, and he wanted to save Hermione because Hermione is his friend as well. So, I mean, he did have some bravery there, but he could have been the first one back and within the time limit, so to speak, because he was the very first one there to rescue Ron, but he was trying to save everybody else as well because he was taking that song to heart and not just listening to it as a passage of the passing of time. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what your comments are, and we'll read some more the next time. Thanks for listening in on this read along with me, guys. I hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your evening. Much love, guys. Bye!